I just want to say thank you, Clyde, for coming. Here's a little bit of background so you know how great he is. He has more than 23 years of experience in the nonprofit sector and has worked with many nonprofit organizations in organizational development and fundraising capacities. He also teaches board governance and resource development for the Nonprofit Management Institute at the ASU Lodestar Center. Mr. Kunz has been actively involved in professional organizations and has served on several nonprofit boards. He currently serves on the boards of directors of 2 private foundations and 1 local and 1 national. So thank you, Clyde, for coming, and let's all welcome him.
Thank you all very, very much for being here. I do a fair amount of presentation, generally on topics related to fundraising, which is the bulk of my background. Some of you I know have been in presentations that I have made on fundraising topics. It's sort of hard to find an opportunity other than through this series at the library to hear topics about nonprofit organization development in general. So I really looked forward to being able to be here with you today and to enter into this topic. I need to know a little bit more about who you are. Can you raise your hand if you're currently working for a nonprofit as a staff member? How many of you are serving on boards of nonprofits? Okay. How many of you have no affiliation to a nonprofit whatsoever? A couple, 3. Okay. Okay. Why? Just out of curiosity, why are you here?
I used to work as a grant writer for Pima County Community Employment and Training.
Okay.
And so now I sort of work for myself and as a freelance grant
Okay.
writer, proposal writer.
I think this is really good. Whether you're staff or board or not working for a nonprofit, many of us during the course of our lives will have an opportunity to serve on some kind of a nonprofit board as a volunteer. This information, I think, is really pertinent, particularly to board members. The board is typically the organization, the structure within the organization that drives policy setting and that really needs to have a grounding in these things. So let's just look at real quickly, just kind of an overview of what policies are and how they differ from procedures. Policies really are, first of all, they should be created by the board, not by the executive director, not by the staff. Policies are driven by the board. And they set up general guidelines for the operations of the organization, as opposed to policies, or procedures rather, that are created by the CEO or the president or the executive director, whoever sits in that role that works for the board. It is that individual's job to implement the policies that are set by the board of directors. And when I see problems in organizations, often it's because those roles get jumbled up. And you'll see the executive director starting to write policy, the board justifiably, there's some backlash against that, or you'll see a board implementing a policy that the executive director is not supporting or doesn't feel should be implemented or doesn't want to implement. So that a lot of organization problems that happen within nonprofits happen for the simple reason that they have not figured out what those 2 roles are and how they should be defined. One of the things that I recommend with the organizations I work with, most all of them have some kind of procedures manual. Even if it's not an organization procedures manual, they'll have procedures manuals that are by department, or some of the departments will have formalized procedure manuals, others will not. Rarely, though, do they have a policies manual. And I think they're equally important. For instance, if there is a question about a policy, staff members need to know that there's a place they can go to see, or if a question about a procedure rather, there should be a place they can go to look up what the procedure is supposed to be for that particular operation. But similarly, there should be a centralized place that employees can go to access policies that have been put in place by the board. Now, for those of you either on boards or staff who are working with nonprofits, is there anyone here that is working with an organization that has a policies manual? You do. Can I ask what organization?
Arizona Wilderness Coalition.
Wilderness Coalition?
Friends of the Pima County Public Library.
Oh, great. And Santa Cruz Community Action Alliance. So some organizations have sort of caught on to the fact that they need to have that centralized policies manual. So that's number one. If you remember nothing else, I have a bad habit of saying, if you remember nothing else, remember this. I'll say it 20 times today. But if you remember nothing else, remember that you want to walk out of here and go back to your organization and say, you know, we need to have a policies manual that's separated by different categories that we can easily look up what current policy is. So, basically think of them like this. Policies are the law. Procedures are the implementation of the law. The board's job is setting the policy. I don't know why I keep getting this. This is like the 5th time, Cassie. And the staff's job is implementation of the law. Okay, so those are just the basic structural things you want to think about. Now, what I'd like you to do is work in groups of, for those of you who have 3 at your table, there are a couple of those, just form groups of 3, sort of wherever you are, groups of 3 or 4. And I'm going to give you a little exercise to do here. And there are a couple of different issues that might pop up in a nonprofit organization. And for each one, I just want you to put a check. There's a column that says policy and a column that says procedure. And I want you to tell me which it is. Okay? These are difficult, aren't they?
Yeah.
I wasn't really trying to make them difficult. They're difficult just by their nature. Part of the problem is that procedure kicks in when after policy is created. They're almost intertwined. And so a lot of these, well, you have to have both a procedure and a policy in place. Did you find that? Did you find that? Let's just look at a few of them. How did you answer the first one? Your auditors tell you need to have more potential check writers. That should be a policy decision. We'll talk about that later. We want to start a new fundraising event each spring. What'd you say to that one? Generally, deciding on how a fundraising plan unfolds is procedural, not policy. Yeah, I would probably put that in the procedures column. Starting a new program that supports our mission.
We put both.
Why is it both?
Well, because you're also talking about the organization's mission, and you're talking also about implementing a procedure, so you need both on that side.
Right, you're talking about implementing the mission. It might even involve a slight change or a different emphasis on the mission. That's policy, that's a board decision. But then putting it in place is the procedural part, okay?
Well, supporting is not changing. It says supports our mission, not changing.
Right, if it supports your mission, probably that is procedural, if it's strictly in supporting the mission,
If you
right?
have a policy in place to allow committees to make those decisions, is what I think.
Put a policy in place that just delegates everything to a committee?
Because I worked with that. Was our
Well,
policy.
and that can work in some
If you wanted to
instances.
do fundraising, then our policy
Right.
would work, so
You know, the issue with the issue though with having a committee that sets policy is it kind of disenfranchises the rest of the board, or it can very easily. And so you have other board members that start saying, well, why do I come to meetings if this group is deciding all these things and I don't have a voice in it? So it can be problematic in that way.
And the other thing is if you have a group that has so much to do that divvying it up is really,
Yeah.
you know, and people align with what they want to do.
We're going to talk about board policies in just a minute. Let's look at some of these others here. What did you do with the one about exchanging lists with a sister organization?
Policy.
Why is it policy?
Donor lists have impertinent information on them that shouldn't be just given to anything and everybody. We need to,
Okay. This one comes up a great deal, because what happens is, you know, Joe and Mary get a solicitation letter from an organization, and they tell their neighbor who's on the board of that organization, why am I getting this? The board member goes back to the organization and says, they don't want to get mailings from us. Why did they receive this? And it came from a borrowed list from another organization. So that kind of thing happens a lot. Boards tend to overreact. I shouldn't say overreact. They tend to react very negatively to that, and they tend to then slam into place a policy that prevents the use of any list from any other organization or giving your list to another organization. A lot of policy comes into play, unfortunately, in reaction to a problem, instead of setting policy proactively. When policies are put in place in reaction to a problem, it's usually bad policy. I can say that pretty much across the board. When it's done in reaction to a problem, it's usually bad policy. This happens so often. Not an hour before this meeting began, I was on a conference call for the national board I'm on, okay? The executive director of that organization had come to the board and said, I've been here 7 years. I've decided I'm going to take 3 months sabbatical this summer. Now, it's an organization in which other similar organizations allow their executive director to take sabbatical, okay? We didn't see it coming. And guess what? We don't have a policy in place for sabbatical. So the reaction from the board was totally negative, just totally negative. And it created this situation where the executive director, who's very, very good, has led the organization phenomenally, is on the verge of quitting because he feels so unsupported by the board of directors. And again, if we had just had a policy in place that we had reasonably thought out, and the executive director knew this is the policy the board has established for sabbaticals, the confrontation never would have happened. Never would have happened. Great question. How do you anticipate what you need policies for? Okay, I mentioned I'm on this board that didn't have that policy in place. That's why we're here. And we're going to go through, you can never anticipate all of the policies that you may need to have in place. You can anticipate many of them. And you can put structures in place that allow for the ongoing review of policies to make sure that you're staying ahead of the curve. It's much like parenting, though. You can never anticipate the questions your teenagers are going to throw at you. You can't. You can think it through, and you can think about categories of things, and gee, I've got to have an answer prepared for drugs, and I've got to have an answer prepared for sex, and I've got to have an answer. You can think about those things, and as soon as you develop the answers you're going to use, they come up with something else that just throws you completely off your game, right? Those of you who have kids know what I'm talking about. It's the same kind of thing. We have to anticipate as much as we can, and we're going to look at categories that will help us do that. Okay? Were there any of these that you really stumbled on, really got stuck on?
The tickets on the website.
I'm sorry? Which one is that? Where is it?
Fundraiser for us, I must have sold tickets on the website.
Ah.
2/3 of the way down.
Policy or procedure? How is it policy? Tell me.
Well, you have to have a policy of what you're going to allow other organizations.
A policy is needed not just for what you put on the website, but the policy that's needed is what kind of relationship are we going to have with other organizations that want to do fundraisers for us. The best example I can think of this was, you may have read about it in the papers, but a year ago last Christmas, so it was Christmas of 2011, you all know about Toys for Tots, right? The organization that raises all the kids. The Marines give the toys to the kids, and great, feel-good kind of stuff, right? Well, a group of women who all happen to be exotic dancers at a particular gentleman's club in Florida decided that they were going to offer free lap dances to men who came in with an unwrapped new toy to donate to Toys for Tots. Okay? You can imagine how the Toys for Tots people reacted to that. Okay, we run into these kinds of problems all the time where organizations that are outside our control with presumably very good intentions, want to do something to help our organization. And then they very often will come to us, and we might have a very collegial relationship with them, but we come to them and we say, well, we're doing this event for you, we're volunteering all these hours, we're spending all this money to do this event, and you're not even putting our event on your website. Why not? So again, having a policy in place that delineates the kind of relationship that you're going to have with third-party organizations wanting to do fundraising for you is really important. And then on top of that, having a policy for what can and cannot go onto your website could nip that in the bud. Right? Other ones that were challenging.
What about diversity on the board?
The one about diversity on the board, okay? I don't remember it actually. What is
Fourth one down.
Fourth one down. We need to bring more diversity to our board and staff. Is that policy or procedure? Depends on what?
It depends on whether the policies say you gotta have a certain mix. And then if you do that mix, that's the implementation of the policy.
Right.
So the question is a little ambiguous.
The great example, this is a great example of the kind of, where is the line? You have to have a policy in place, and the policy is exactly as this gentleman said. We need a policy in place that says it is our goal to diversify the board in this way, this way, and this way. It is then the responsibility of others, or maybe even the same people, because board development is usually a board responsibility. But it's the responsibility of the people charged with that to then implement that policy. Yes?
So we actually have that written into our bylaws.
Mm-hmm.
So that would make it a policy, period.
Yes, yeah. That's sort of kicking it up the ladder even a higher notch, yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I'm in the middle of writing HR policies, so everything in my mind right now is, can you be sued? And, sorry.
You can be sued for anything.
I know. But if you put that diversity clause in policy, aren't you opening yourself up if you don't diversify by that amount?
Any attorneys in the room? I'm not an attorney. But I wouldn't say that, first of all, I would never recommend that a policy say, we're going to have X number of people who represent this category of people, although some bylaws do.
Yes, Alabama does.
Yeah. Some,
Ours is not an ethnicity or
You
Right.
define diversity would be the first thing.
it's, we're a childhood cancer foundation, so we have a certain number of, it is parent run, so a certain number of people on the board have kids with cancer.
Yeah. This diversity issue on the board is something you see very often with human services organizations that require that a certain percentage of their board be comprised of clients or of representation from the client base they serve. Going back to your question about whether an organization could be sued for not adhering to that policy, I do not know. I do not know. Okay. Others of these that were particularly challenges? Okay. Have any of you had issues come up on nonprofits you've been affiliated with, big problems that have happened because of the lack of a policy or because of a policy being inadequate? that was quick. Can you share? Is it an issue you can share?
Well, I was the interim assistant executive director for a local non-for-profit here, and actually, I don't want to go into too much detail, but the executive director had taken a policy workbook from an organization that was not like a non-for-profit to deal with our employees. It was our employee handbook. She had taken a handbook from a retail restaurant, and that was our employee handbook. And so the situation was totally different. A restaurant, and I'm not going to name the restaurant because then people might say, oh, I know who that is. they're hiring people off the street, they're hiring people that are not educated, they're hiring people that, it's a revolving door of folks.
They require
But
you to wash your hands.
Right, but
Yeah.
non-for-profit, we're working with professionals, hopefully, and so it caused some problems and some issues.
Yeah.
So that
that's a good example of an inadequate HR policy.
So, yeah, we had an organization wanting to fundraise in a related area, wanting our list of our never mind donors and families to then solicit from, and actually became a contentious board issue.
And it became a contentious board issue because there was no policy regarding that in place?
Correct.
Okay.
Although there is a policy of when families sign up to us, that they're signing up to us and nobody else. So in fact, that was what, contained the whole issue ultimately, but,
Yeah.
yeah.
Other examples?
We had the same
Ken?
one.
You had the same example of list
use of
sharing?
a donor list.
Use of a donor list. That one comes up a fair amount. Yes? You. Cassie, I'm going to make you exercise. Can we go back and
I
forth?
worked for a
and back and forth?
nonprofit in New Hampshire that had a policy manual that was written in 1985, and this was 4 years ago.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
nothing applied. So when you would go to the policy manual to say, oh, but, well, that was before the internet. It was really, really difficult. And
Yeah.
employment laws had changed, so much had changed, and nobody updated it.
That's huge. And I bet if I asked right now, I won't embarrass anyone, but if I asked right now how many of you have HR policies that have sections in them dealing with use of social media in the workplace, a few do. It's becoming a huge, huge issue where employees are being counseled, they're being terminated in some cases for being on Facebook on their computer all day instead of doing their work. And of course they're coming back and saying, show me where you told me I can't be on Facebook. Okay.
We actually we want our people to be on our Facebook page. But I have another question. So Angel Charity, if they choose you as an organization to fund, they want access, and part of their agreement with you, if you're going to be funded by them, is to have complete access to your donor lists and books. So, if you have a policy in place before you try and apply for funding there, what do? Change your policy, or?
Well, and this is a good example, though, of why you don't want to implement policy in reaction to a problem or in reaction to a situation. You want to have the policy in place so that you've got the time, you've got the luxury of time for staff to go to the board and say, if you implement this policy the way it's written, which prevents us from sharing any donor information, it will prevent us from making an application at any time in the future to Angel Charities because they will require access to that information. Do you want to change the language of this to enable us to be able to do that? It's one of the reasons that staff and board have to work really closely together in the implementation of policy so that board has all of the data they need and all of the voices that they need to hear before they put ink to paper and codify it. That's a great example. It's a great example. Yes, ma'am. I promised you. Right here. Right here.
Sometimes you may not, my thinking is you can't know everything. So something is going to come up at some point. And so what do you do in that circumstance, like the executive director who wanted to take the sabbatical, they didn't have, of course, the policy, but they're going to have to make a decision before they just leave, right? So I see it as two-pronged because they're going to have to make a decision.
Right.
But at the same time, they also need to make sure that this come up again. They need to do something about it.
Right.
So that's my understanding of,
Well, you're absolutely right. And again, we're going to look at several different areas of nonprofit management and talk about the kinds of policies that you should think about in each of those areas. You're never going to cover everything. You'll never cover everything. Yes, sir.
What happens when you have the situation where your board members feel that they are adults and they don't need a policy to tell them that they can or cannot do something?
Wow, that's a problem. That is a problem. The board.
They don't want the board. They don't want a policy or a code of conduct. Call it what you want, to tell them that they cannot do or they can do something at an event, for example. It has to do with alcohol.
Yeah. Ah, the alcohol question. That's a good one. Yeah. So you.
I said, let me answer that question because I've had that experience.
Great.
I've managed nonprofits for about 45 years in my lifetime. And I've run into just about every situation you could think of. Now, directly to his question, I had a bunch of board members that felt the same way. Half the board says we need your guidance, meaning me, to help us put together things. The other half said we don't need anything because we're adults, we're all professionals, we know what we're doing. So what I had the board do is agree to hire an outside consultant to train the board.
Yeah.
The board was trained, and I didn't attend the meeting. I had nothing to do with it. Matter of fact, I went on vacation for that weekend retreat. That Monday morning, things were entirely different because an outside person had no responsibility, no relationship to me or to that board, told them what they needed to do.
Thank you for saying that. Let me tell you, I've been consulting since 2000, and often I'm called in to facilitate board retreats, facilitate board workshops, and I always carve out time to sit down with the executive first, the executive director, to say, tell me 3 things you've been trying to get your board to do that they won't listen to. And generally within the first hour of the retreat, I've got them all nodding their heads saying, how come you didn't tell us that? Saying that to the executive director. I call it the guy from Detroit syndrome. You know, you can bring somebody in from outside who can say exactly what you've been saying for the last 10 years, and they'll hear it from somebody from the outside. So sometimes you're absolutely right. Bringing in an outside voice can help move a board in a particular direction, and it may be exactly the direction you've been trying to get them to go, but just having that outside voice does the trick. Thank you for saying that. Okay. Let's look at the different areas of nonprofit management that we did that already. We want to look at. If I were working with any of your organizations and said you need a policies manual, it would be a big loose leaf binder that would have these sections in it, and you would have a tab on every one of these, and maybe some other ones that I haven't thought about. But these are the ones we're going to talk about today. Board governance, staff and employment, volunteer management, financial management, investments as a separate category from financial management, fund development, marketing and public relations, promotions, program policies, information management, advocacy, and then there's a bunch of other stuff we're going to talk about as well. Are there other categories you can think of that we've missed there that we really ought to address? Okay. We're just going to start. Yes, ma'am.
If you have a facility that you manage, there should be a facility.
That's in miscellaneous. Okay. It's a PowerPoint problem. I couldn't put another bullet in there without. Okay. Policies for the board itself, and this comes back to your question a little bit, 'cause sometimes the board feels like they don't need to have policies. The issue there is they need to understand they're not always going to be on the board, so the policies need to be codified for people who are coming on after, okay? And part of the board orientation, I hope most of you in your organizations, when you bring new board members into the organization, you have some kind of an orientation process for them. We tend to go through all the usual things. Let's tell them about all our programs. Let's tell them how to read the financial statements, all that stuff. But added to that list on that agenda should be telling them about existing policies. it will save you a lot of time and headache. A lot of time and headache. One of the things we're going to talk about later, for instance, is fundraising policies. And there are some very easy for boards to adopt documents that are, you don't even have to write anything. It's just like we would like to propose that we adopt this as our ethical statement as a board of directors, or ethical fundraising statement. When you have new board members come in, if they don't know that, I guarantee you within 2 months, 1 or 2 of them are going to recommend that you do something in fundraising that's considered unethical according to the code that is part of the board policy. So it's really important that you introduce new board members to existing policies just to save time and headache. Okay? How many of you have a contributions policy for your board? Wow, 4 hands, 5, 6. Good. Good. I'm sorry?
You better have one for grants.
Yeah. Board, I'm always surprised at how many boards don't have a policy in place. Even if it's what I call a generic policy of every board member is expected to give or get personal to give personal dollars and to help raise outside dollars. The most successful boards I've been on have been boards that have those policies in place, and I'll tell you why. In my experience, people's hearts are directly connected to their wallet. They really don't care about your organization enough if they're not willing to make a personal contribution to the organization. And it doesn't really matter what the amount is. The amount can vary. I'm on a board right now that has people who write $25,000 checks and people who are in high school on the same board. And they all have an equal voice at the table because the policy implemented by that board is that every board member is expected to make a contribution annually to this organization of an amount that puts this contribution among the top 3 charitable organizations they make during the year. So the high school students can give $5 a month, and the woman sitting next to her at the board table can write a check for $25,000 and not feel it, and they have an equal voice at the table. They have an equal voice at the table. But I think it's really important that you have a written board contributions policy. How many have a policy outlining the expectations of participation on the board? Now, I want to make a distinction here. Is it a policy or is it just part of an application form they fill out when they join the board? It's in the bylaws for you. Wow, you put a lot of stuff in your bylaws. That's okay. How many of you just have it on an application form or of some kind?
I guess,
But you actually have a written policy?
I think with UH, University High School Foundation, they're a pretty young board, but they put it into, like, when you join the board, they have this thing you sign that says you're going to do all these things with the policies.
Okay.
And then now they've created a book.
Yeah. It's a really, however you have it written down, consolidating it as part of your policies manual is what's important, I think. Another issue that pops up a lot with organizations is the expectations put upon board members to participate in the programs of the organization or to participate in the fundraising events of the organization or whatever. And again, going back to that third-party fundraiser idea, where you've got an outside group, wow, if I had to count the battles that I've had to fight because this outside group has come back to the organization to say, there was only one member of your board at our event. We're raising money for you. Where was the board? Well, nobody ever told the board that they told them about the event, but there was no policy in place saying that they were required to attend these things. So again, that's an issue that should be thought through and codified so you're not stuck with those problems and having to react to them. Conflict of interest. I'm hoping most of you have a conflict of interest for your board. So they're not doing any self-dealing. They're not, you don't have any brokers on the board who are doing your investment for you and making a little bit of profit off of that investment, that kind of thing. okay, or making decisions that benefit their company or that benefit another organization they're affiliated with. That conflict of interest stuff is very, very important. Confidentiality. I'm guessing most of the human services organization have a confidentiality policy. Yes? Those who are serving people. What about the rest of you? What would be the need of a confidentiality policy?
Donor information.
Donor information is one area.
Working with youth.
Working with youth, certainly. What else?
Staff HR information,
I'm sorry?
information about staff.
Information about staff.
HR stuff.
Just protecting privacy
Of whom?
of clients.
Okay.
Volunteer information, not sharing that.
Okay. Volunteer. Did you have, you said it?
I would think there'd need to be some confidentiality within the board as well.
Within the board itself. Now, we have to be a little careful with this. In Arizona, every nonprofit board meeting is by law an open meeting. Anyone from off the street who wants to attend your board meeting can do so unless you go into executive session. Okay, but every board meeting is falls under the open meeting law. So there are things that get discussed in board meetings that sometimes you really don't want to have out there. You need to make sure that those things get discussed in executive session and that there is a confidentiality policy in place that requires board members to adhere to that. Okay. Are there other, yes, I can see that question.
I was going to ask about another board issue.
Another board issue? Please ask, Cassie gave up on me a little while ago with the microphone.
How do you encourage a board to help you with fundraising?
We will talk about policies, about fundraising policies later on, but in terms of fundraising, I mean, that's a whole other topic
board,
than policies.
Yeah.
But you can have in place policies at the board level that have to do with board expectations of individual board members. And part of that is a contributions policy, and part of that is probably also some kind of involvement in the fundraising process. Now, generally, I would not be too specific about that. I mean, if you've got somebody who wants to be on your board, who has a great background, who's writing that check for $25,000 a year and says, but I can't help with fundraising, I usually back off of those people, okay? I usually back off and leave them alone. But
those people may have other friends that can also contribute $25,000.
right, so that goes to what kind of policy you have. And is it a give policy? Is it a give and get policy? Is it just a get policy? Or does it cover all three? And when I teach fundraising, I also teach that fundraising for boards, I also try to instill in them that fundraising is not just about asking for money. Fundraising is about introducing people to the organization. It's about bringing them along and bringing them along and bringing them along so they do get asked for a gift at some point. And then it's thanking them and thanking them and thanking them. And all of that is part of the fundraising process. And that every board member needs to agree to be part of that process somehow. So, you know, you get these people who are just scared to death to ask for money, and you know, God love them, they shouldn't be asking for money if it frightens them that much. But I try to encourage them to become involved in the fundraising process and not be scared of one question that happens in the middle of the process. Yes, ma'am.
Sometimes I think you may even have the wrong board. But let's say that a board was started early 1984, for example, and there were people that came on the board that sort of helped the founding of this particular organization. But now we're in 2013, the board members, the board doesn't look the same. So when they came on, they didn't have to contribute. Mm-hmm. So you'll have all that stress of people who are now expected to contribute. And so my question is, sometimes the board that was constructed 20 years ago may not be the board that you need right now that's going to help you.
You're absolutely right. Boards change and policies change, or they should, to adapt to what's going on currently. One of the best things I've seen for implementing, for instance, a board giving policy is to grandfather it. You know, so the policy becomes any new board member who joins this board of directors after January 1st, 2013 will their policy is that they will be expected to give $1,000 a year to the organization. So it lets some of those old people off, not old people, but old board members, they might be old people, I don't know. It lets them off the hook. But you know what generally happens is these new board members start coming on and making contributions, and you know, this group of people that's not making contributions becomes smaller and smaller and smaller, and they start feeling peer pressure. They start feeling peer pressure. So, Cassie, I don't know how to make this go away.
I tried to fix it with the 4 hours.
Me too. It doesn't work.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry.
Okay.
We'll try it during the break.
I'll deal with it. Okay. But doing that kind of grandfathering thing can help. Can help. Another thing that I found, we're getting a little bit off topic here, but in terms of board giving, I worked with one board a number of years ago that had no policy in place for board giving. Their board was giving fairly well. Some weren't giving at all, and some were giving a lot. Their average board gift was about $1,800 a year. And I was working with the executive director, and she said, "What can I do? What can I do? They won't pass a policy requiring a board gift." And I said, "Well, why don't you start going into the board meeting, you know, a couple of times a year, 3 times a year, and saying, 'Great news, our average board gift is $1,800. Isn't that wonderful?" There's this little thing about human psychology that nobody likes to be below average. And so people that were giving $1,000 a year thought, "Wow, I'm in the bottom half, I need to pull it up." And they started writing checks for $2,000, which of course brought the average up. And the next time she went to the meeting, she said, I can't believe you guys, you're so wonderful. Our average board gift is now $2,137. And guess what? 6 months later, it was over $2,500. The average kept going up because people didn't want to be below average. So there are all kinds of little tricks that you can put in place that can help promote that kind of thing on a board if, in fact, and then eventually what happened with that organization was for years they've been considering this board policy of a minimum gift of $1,500. When they finally got around to voting on it again, they said, "Well, we're all giving that more than that now." So they put in place the policy that every board member was required to give $1,500 a year. So that can be, you know, sometimes these things take a little work and a little strategy, but they can be done. I want to move on and get through one more of these categories before we take a break, or maybe 2. We'll see. Personnel policies. We've talked about HR policies. It is remarkable how many organizations. Someone used the example of the board of the Human Resource Policies Manual. It was from 1985 or something. It's remarkable how seldom nonprofit organizations look at these things. It's just absolutely remarkable. And HR law is something that changes all the time. All the time. So there should be, if there's not, there should be some committee of the board that's designated to annually look at policies for human resources. It's just absolutely critical. How many of you have a substance abuse policy, for instance? Sexual harassment policy? How many of you have a confidentiality policy for staff members? A few. How many of you have a grievance policy? A whistleblower policy? Okay, these things are really, you know, in the for-profit workplace, these are becoming standard issue items. These are things that you're expected to have in the for-profit workplace, and in nonprofit, we're having a hard time catching up. And usually it falls to the board, and they're just not looking at them. They have to have a process in place for reviewing them every year. Yes, ma'am. Really loud.
This might be a little lot for the organization, but has her own personal Facebook page and tends to post a lot, hey, help us raise money, blah, blah, blah. But on her Facebook page, she also has a lot of really inappropriate stuff because she's a young.
What do I do about that? I would say, what's the policy regarding Facebook use? You know what? And we're,
What they can do on their own personal Facebook page.
well, but as I understand it, this individual is putting information about the organization on her Facebook page, which again, we're going to talk, somebody was talking about it earlier, we're going to be talking about marketing and promotion issues and having policies related to those. So if you have a policy in place that pertains to how the organization's name can be used, how the organization's logo can be used, how images from the organization's events can and cannot be used, if that kind of policy is in place, it could govern someone using those things on their individual Facebook page. Okay. There's a story here in no.
I've got a problem with that because even if you don't identify the group or your organization on your Facebook page, and people know you from the outside as a member or an employee of that nonprofit, I think you still have to be careful what you put out there on Facebook. So
Yeah, you do.
I think it's a slippery, this whole social media thing is a slippery slope.
It's very, the organization can still require of its employees, that you're not allowed to use our logo outside work, the context of work. You can do that kind of thing. You're right. There's a lot of undefined stuff related to social media. There's an example in this town about a year ago, a very high-level position in this town. A national search was done. The individual was hired, was made an offer to take this job, and within 24 hours had gone on his personal Facebook page and dissed Tucson. Well, I'm being sent to purgatory, Tucson, Arizona. I hope I don't have to stay there more than a couple of years. That kind of stuff, okay? And of course, the offer was rescinded, like immediately. Immediately, okay? There wasn't even a question about it. Okay, that social media stuff is scary, and I don't know where HR, are you an HR attorney or something, or no?
No, I've just been immersed in it.
You've been immersed in it. Okay.
I just realized, just as an example, I work at a hospital, and they do have a policy, now that I think about it. I don't go on Facebook. But there is a policy that if we say we work, if we click on, put on Facebook that that's where we work, they hold us responsible for anything that might be inappropriate.
Yeah.
That could be somehow related to where we work.
Getting back to this gentleman's comment, though, I don't know if the law has progressed far enough to know whether or not that will hold up in court if somebody actually challenged it. I just don't know. I don't know. We have a lot to find out. But what bothers me is that so many nonprofits don't address it in their policies at all.
Like the young lady over here said, I had worked at a previous nonprofit before I'm at the one I'm at now, where there was a policy where if we announced on Facebook or other social media that this was our place of employment, that we then opened ourselves up to being either terminated or reprimanded for inappropriate comments made about our place of work. However, this same place also instilled a training that everybody had to go through on how we play nice on Facebook.
Wow.
In order, and because they have assessed that a lot of, especially the younger generations coming up, simply do not have a filter about what we should be posting for the entire world to see.
Yeah.
So that kind of thing.
Yeah, I was actually just listening to a radio program today that was talking about Twitter, and that Twitter has become the new place to really insult people really horribly. Because and they were reading some of these things that people had posted about celebrities on on Twitter, and it was like, I mean, stuff that I would think that, you know, whoever authored this stuff could be sued for. I mean, it was really ugly stuff. But you're right. I mean, people just don't know where the boundaries are. So I mean, I like the idea of giving some kind of training for what is appropriate, what is considered inappropriate by this organization.
Just a comment.
Yes, ma'am.
We see actually a lot of people within Congress also that, you know, Sarah Palin is notorious for posting stuff that's inappropriate too. So you know, I'm glad that you're talking about the fact that you have to be very careful what you
Yeah.
put out there for people to actually see.
Yeah, you really do. It's but again, as nonprofits, you know, we should be really ahead of the curve on this stuff and trying to teach our employees and teach our board members how we want them and not want them to represent the organization or represent themselves if they're making it known that they're affiliated with the organization. Two different issues.
Basically, what you're doing is also selling an image too, and you want to make sure that, you know, that it matches also, you know, the mission. So you have to also be careful, I guess, and reiterate that even to the board or the people that are affiliated, that this is the mission. I'm talking about the fact, you know, that we're in a small area. So you want to make sure that the people that are affiliated and provide to the public a good image, because it's a nonprofit, and basically nonprofits, what they're trying to do is promote something that the community is going to benefit from it.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, it's so easy. We're going to talk about about information technology policies after the break, but you know, there's so many examples of auxiliary type organizations that they get frustrated with the organization's policies about what can be posted on the website, for instance, so they just create their own website. So then you lose complete control. So, you know, having it all worked out and having all the parties who might be involved in it part of the discussion is really important. Did you have
another?
another?
Make the comment that, you know, there has been this disclaimer in the media that, you know, the opinions of this person don't necessarily reflect the opinions of the broadcasting or whatever. And I really think it's a slippery slope because I have a young daughter too, but, you know, that an organization becomes morality police to some level, you know, because there is a lot of benefit. I've used Facebook, whether sometimes the negativity can be also positive in a way that an organization really needs to be careful that they don't rein it in too much, because there are really a lot of benefits. If somebody likes your organization, they post it, and maybe they're into other things that maybe you don't agree with. We just you know, we have to just draw the line. We cannot be the morality police of Facebook.
Boy, I would absolutely agree. You cannot be morality police, but what you can say is if you choose to post X, Y, and Z on your personal Facebook account, please don't identify yourself as working here.
Right. How they affiliate with you, that's one thing. But if they're just supporting you, you know, that's another.
That's a Band-Aid. That's a Band-Aid. If people know you, people know you outside of Facebook, it doesn't really matter. And if they see you in Facebook and they see how you might react to something politically, for example, it doesn't matter. I mean,
well, I can tell you, for example, Livestrong does. I've noticed they do a lot of great service. That was started by Lance Armstrong. I don't think that I'm necessarily going to disaffiliate with Livestrong because of Lance, even though it will affect some people. I think that I believe that in general people are intelligent and they're going to make intelligent choices and they're going to know the difference. Especially ones that I've been on the computer since the 80s, so especially those of us who have been on the computer since the 80s, because it has really gotten much better in many ways.
Yeah, well, I've been, you know, the first computer I had foot treadles on it to make it go, you know, but okay. We can't write the policy here. And you can see just from this discussion that there are so many different permutations of how this could be set up. It's going to vary a lot from organization to organization to organization. An organization that's working, for instance, with underprivileged children is probably going to be much more sensitive about what their employees are posting on Facebook than an organization that is a different kind of organization entirely. So, you know, I think there are nuances to this that are going to be different from organization to organization, but the issue is we got to talk about it. You can't just let a problem occur and then discipline somebody for something that they didn't know was a problem. That's really the issue. So every organization needs to approach it in a different way based on their own mission, based on the clients they serve, based on how they're trying to represent themselves to and in the community. Okay? I want to just come back to one other one. We mentioned conflict of interest for boards of directors. Do you have your employees sign a conflict of interest policy? Some nods. It's a good idea. It's a really good idea. Okay? You get, for instance, somebody working in doing marketing for your organization, who on the side is making some extra money by doing marketing for your competitor. Okay? Or a fundraiser who's on the side is doing fundraising for your competitor. So a conflict of interest policy for members of staff is as important as it is for members of boards, and most organizations, I don't think, bother to think about it. Yes, sir.
The best place to put that is in the bylaws, because the Internal Revenue Service, when you're going for a 501c3, requires you to have a conflict of interest statement in the application. So if you put it in the bylaws, you're covered.
Yeah, the most recent bylaw stuff is
Okay.
comprehensive.
Bylaws trump policy. That's the bottom line. But you don't want to have bylaws that are 20 pages long either. You want to, your bylaws typically are a more succinct document. Policies are a little more free-ranging. But there are some things that probably belong there. I've worked with organizations that have delineated 10 or 12 different committees of the board that have to be in place. I mean, that kind of stuff, as far as I'm concerned, does not belong in the bylaws at all. At all, because committees need to be a little more flexible than that. You need to have the ability to say at the beginning of a year, our emphasis this year really needs to be on fundraising, and we need to have 3 different fundraising committees doing these 3 different functions. If your bylaws are too restrictive in terms of your organizational structure, sometimes it inhibits the organization in terms of the way it needs to grow. But let's move on real quickly to financial management policies, and then we'll take a break, okay? These are really important, and I believe most organizations probably have these in place. Policies pertaining to banking relationships and how those are established. For instance, if the people on staff who are dealing with the finances don't like their bank and they just decide to change banks, is that okay? Or is that something that is covered by a policy decision made by the board that puts a process in place for how that's done? As one example, who has access to that information? I worked with one organization that was working with a bank that was giving them online access to their accounts. And the bank had a board of directors list with email addresses on it, and they just sent a link to this information to the entire board. Well, maybe that's okay, but should there be a policy in place governing who has access and who doesn't? Policies regarding cash handling, credit card processing, all of these things. I've done quite a bit of work with faith-based organizations who for many, many years, and some of them still do, refuse to accept credit cards because they see a lot of people putting too much debt on credit cards, and because they're faith-based, they believe that debt is bad, and they don't want people putting money, making a donation to the church or the synagogue by putting it on a credit card. So, but again, that's a policy decision that the board needs to take up, because it's really, in the absence of a policy, it's really easy for a new administrator to come in and say, hey, we're the only organization in town not taking credit cards, and they just go out and set it up. So putting a policy in place regarding how you want that stuff utilized is important. online transactions we talked about. Policy from the board regarding audits, how frequently they're done, how often the auditor that is selected to do that process goes up for review, all of those things. And I would guess that most nonprofit organizations probably have pretty good financial management policies in place. That seems to be one area that nonprofits do focus on. Smaller nonprofits is kind of a learning curve in some instances, but certainly for larger nonprofits, it's generally the norm. Any questions about financial management policies? Going to take about a 7-minute break. According to that clock, I'm going to start up again right at 5 o'clock. We've got much more to go through, and I'll hang up here. If anyone has any questions during the break, feel free to come up. Up again. There might be a few that are still coming in, but that's okay. There were several comments during the break. One was, you know, gee, we have all these policies, but they're all word of mouth. They're not written down. Okay. Whoa. Staff turns over too quickly. Board members turn over too quickly, and the ones that don't turn over, like the organization you're talking about, they just get old. And they don't remember. Or they misremember. Or they believe a policy was put in place, and yeah, the board voted on that, but there's no record that the board ever really did vote on it. So you get that kind of thing. Yes, sir.
Because I was going to say, I mean, oral tradition is fine in policies. I work in libraries. I'm retired now, I work in libraries. And you know how many times you have something to point at, either gifts, because you're going to unload the junk on you, or parents complaining about the reading material. Boy, you want something, believe me, in writing.
Yeah. One of the best things, and I don't know if you all heard that, but from working in a library background, people try to give you boxes of books that are, you know, from 1943 and they're science textbooks. Okay, so you get that kind of thing, and they want a tax write-off for it, and we're going to talk about that specifically in a few minutes. But you also get parents complaining about content of books, and so there needs to be a policy for what goes into the children's section. Policies in many, many instances can be your salvation. As a fundraiser, many, many times I've had people come to me and they want to donate. You know, I want to make this huge donation. I've got this parcel of property I want to give your organization. Oh, by the way, it used to be an abandoned service station in Bisbee, and I haven't been able to sell it in 10 years because there's so much toxic waste in the ground. But they want to give it to you for the tax write-off. And it's really nice to be able to say, oh, Mr. Jones, you've been such a magnificent donor to this organization. We appreciate you so much. I can't tell you how generous that is of you. But our board of directors put in place a policy for the acceptance of real estate, and it has to be accompanied by a stage 2 environmental review that you need to pay for so that they can review the acceptability of that gift. So, you know, that kind of thing can prevent you from getting into an altercation with somebody who's important to the organization. So policies can be really, really important, as you discovered with the policy about what kinds of books can go into the children's section of the library. Okay? Policies can really be helpful. There was another example. Do you want to share your example? Where's the mic? Because you had an example of financial policies run amok, or...
Yes, I worked at a church in New Hampshire, so I'm not, you know, you guys would never figure out where it is, which is good. But
I know where New Hampshire is.
You get the gold star. But when I began working there, part of my job was, as administrator, was to try and figure out what was going on financially. And we had a bookkeeper who stole $10,000. And nobody ever put policies into place financially because, oh, we're a church and nobody would ever steal from a church. They have policies.
Yeah. Thank you.
And including a policy what to do if someone does steal, how it gets reported to the police.
Very good. Very good. Great example. Thank you. Other thoughts you had during the break? Anything about financial policies before I move on? Okay. These are really important. And when you do have a problem, with, such as was just described, with somebody embezzling, if you land up in court against that person, the first thing they're going to ask for is, let me see your policies governing the finances of the organization. It's the first thing they're going to ask for. The first thing. And the next question is going to be, when is the last time these were reviewed? Okay. And then they're going to ask a few of your board members, have you ever seen these policies? And then they're going to ask a few of your staff members, were these policies ever given to you when you started working there? Okay. It's all going to be about the policy. It's all going to be about the policy. I don't know what's going on. Sorry about the computer glitches. Not my laptop, not my laptop. Okay? I want to move on to talk about investment policies. These are distinctly different than the financial policies we were just talking about on the prior slide. If you're lucky enough to have endowment or to receive an endowment gift, you need to have policies governing how those endowment dollars can be invested and how they cannot be invested. And the same with any non-endowment funds that you're investing. Generally, those are two different policies or two different sections of the same policy, because non-endowment reserves you want to be able to access at some point if you need to make a major expenditure. But the endowment policies, endowment, of course, is money that's given to you that you can't spend the corpus of. Basically, you can't spend the principal, you can only spend the earnings. So you're going to invest that very differently. So having policies in place for those, as well as distribution policies for how that money when and how that money can be taken out. Now, investment policies for endowment typically are invested very differently than an individual with significant means would invest their money. If you think about an individual's life, if a wealthy woman makes her money in her 50s, she's probably not going to live more than 30, maybe if she's lucky, 40 years. So the investment horizon that she needs to invest that money for is 40 years. With an organization's endowment, since it's money that can never be spent, that investment horizon for that money is infinite. So the profile of a portfolio for endowment looks very different than the portfolio for an individual's investment. So it's really important that the policy for that investment be really thought out with that in mind, and not just handed to some guy on the board because he's a broker and he can invest it for us, because he might not have that kind of institutional expertise. So there needs to be a policy in place governing that. Same with distribution. How and when can money be taken out of an endowment? It's really easy to say, well, endowment, we can't spend the principal, we'll just spend all the earnings. But the problem with that is, in some years, the market, when it's doing really well, might earn 25%. And wow, you're in the money. And another year, the market might earn a negative 9%. Well, what do you do in that year? Do you take money you don't have and put it back? So there needs to be a policy in place for how you can calculate distributions from the endowment so that it evens that out over time. And Arizona law allows you to do that as an organization, to invest money in such a way that it's designed to grow to keep pace with inflation, but also at the same time to take out a certain amount of money so that over time you're using essentially all of the earnings. Okay? But again, having a policy specified by the board to do that will save you a lot of heartache when you bring somebody onto the board who thinks they know how to do it better than the current investment managers, and that happens way too often. Okay? Also, a policy for how often you reevaluate who is doing that investing for you, and putting out an RFP every X number of years to several different investment management firms to make sure that you're getting the biggest bang for your buck and you're really using the organization's assets well and not spending too much to do it. Fund development policies. This is my primary area of expertise, is fundraising. I mentioned earlier the gifts acceptance policy with the example of the real estate. Gifts acceptance is a critical policy that your board needs to address if you don't have one. Gifts acceptance typically is broken down into 3 parts. There's a part of it that says these are things that we will always take. Cash, cash equivalents, marketable securities, etc. There's a section, pardon me, there's a section there that says these are things we may or may not take, but they have to go through some kind of review process first. That would include things like real estate. It would include collectibles. What do I mean by collectibles? Primarily art. You know, people go out to these art openings and they drink like 17 glasses of wine and they look at something that is just hideous and they think it's gorgeous and they spend $20,000 for it and they take it home and everyone kind of comes in and says, oh, that's nice. And they realize they don't want it in their home anymore. They can't sell it, so they give it to a nonprofit and they want a $20,000 tax write-off. The problem is the nonprofit can't sell it either. So there needs to be a policy in place for how and when do we accept gifts of art, or gifts of jewelry, or automobiles. There needs to be a policy for the organization for how to handle those, and that's that middle section of the gifts acceptance policy. I'll tell you a story. My first job here in Tucson in 1995, I became the executive director of an organization I won't name, but I kept looking at the financial reports, and they had an endowment of like $800,000. Okay? And, well, that's great. But the endowment earnings were like $1,000. That doesn't make sense. You know, it ought to be significantly more than $1,000 a year. So I sat down with the finance director and I said, okay, I'm not understanding this correlation here. We've got $800,000 in endowment on our balance sheet. We're earning $1,000 a year. She said, yeah, that's right. Why are we only earning $1,000 a year? And she said, well, let me show you the list of the endowment assets. Timeshare condominium in Flagstaff that we couldn't sell. A single cemetery plot out on the cemetery out on East Grant. There were 4 pieces of art that collectively were appraised on the endowment list as being worth like $250,000 between the 4 of them. And I said, okay, where are these paintings? And she said, oh, I don't know. I've been here 11 years. I've never seen them. I went to no fewer than 10 board members who'd been on the board for a long time. Do you know anything about these paintings? No clue. No clue. Nobody knew where they were. We finally, in a closet, found 2 of the paintings. They were quite small. Paintings of Kachina dolls, oil paintings of Kachina dolls, that we tried to sell and eventually gave to our auxiliary, who sold them for $25, both of them. Okay? That's the problem with taking collectibles.
Should have gone to Antiques Roadshow. You never know.
This predated Antiques Roadshow, I'm afraid. But that's the problem with those kinds of gifts, okay? And a gifts acceptance policy that has a process in place for acceptance of collectibles is really important. Now, if someone comes in the door and they say, I inherited this original Picasso from my grandmother and I've got all the provenance papers that go with it proving its authenticity, you probably want to have it checked out and maybe take it, you know, okay? But, you know, the piece of art that somebody just got tired of in their home and claimed they spent $30,000 for, you want to have a piece of paper in between you and that gift, okay? Third category on the gifts acceptance policy are the gifts that you just never want to touch.
I have a question, just because.
Sure.
You know, when a teacher has bought all these books, okay, a teacher has bought a bunch of books and she, you know, has had her accountant put them whatever their list price is. I mean, what is the policy with the IRS and, you know, a gift? I would think that's a big responsibility to evaluate something that somebody's given you.
A great question. Nonprofit organizations should never be valuing gifts. Okay, when you get in-kind gifts, you should be sending the donor a letter saying, thank you for the box of books. Okay, the valuation of that gift is between them and the IRS.
That's what I thought.
Okay. All right. Anyway, gifts acceptance policy, really important. I can't tell you how many times a gift acceptance policy has saved my butt. Of all the policies we've talked about, it's probably one of the most important because it so often comes between you and a donor to your organization.
Can you add color to that third one? You say gifts you don't want to touch.
Oh, yes. Gifts you don't want to touch. My wife and I are getting a divorce. I want to give you my half of the house.
No, we didn't.
Happened. My partner and I, we've been together for 20 years in our business. We're no longer getting along. I want to give you my half of the business. Okay? Half of anything you don't want to take, basically. Okay? You also don't want to take privately held assets, privately held stock that's not traded on a stock exchange. There are certain kinds of real estate gifts you might want to list out that you don't want to take. That kind of thing. Okay? As examples. There are really good examples. I'm going to give you some websites you can go to later to look at some examples of policies, but there's some really good examples out there of gift acceptance policies, and I can give you one too if you want, that I've created that I use as sort of a shell with organizations I'm working with. But next category, ethical fundraising policies. Every board should have them. And I'll tell you, as a fundraiser, the problem I run into all the time is this. The AFP, which is the Association of Fundraising Professionals, Code of Ethical Standards and Professional Practice, states very clearly, among other things, fundraisers working for nonprofits cannot be paid on a commission or percentage basis, period. It's unethical. It's just unethical to receive a cut of donations that are being made to your organization by donors. The problem is, nonprofit organizations are run by community volunteers. We try to recruit business people to our boards. We get these business people on our boards, and the first thing out of their mouth is, I run a successful business. I've got a sales force. The way I make my sales force perform, I get results when I increase the percentage that I pay them. We need to pay our fundraisers on a percentage basis, and fundraising will go up. I've heard it 100 times in working in nonprofit. You see it over and over and over. But if the board has a policy, if they've accepted one of these policies as their policy, saying we as a board accept the principles laid out in the AFP Code of Ethical Practice and Professional Standards for nonprofit fundraisers, that specifically says that we can't pay on a commission basis, that stops the conversation. Otherwise, it will go on and on and on over 12 board meetings. Similarly, the Donor Bill of Rights is really important. And it's really simple. How many of you have the Donor Bill of Rights or use it? A few. Good. Good. What organization? Are you together with the same organization? Tucson Audubon. Great. The donor, has your board actually incorporated that as part of their policy?
We're in the process of doing that.
You're in the process of doing that. That's great. I urge you all to look at these documents and urge your boards to accept them as policy. They don't have to write anything. They just have to raise their hand. Okay? But they're really important. The Donor Bill of Rights lays out things like, a donor has a right to confidentiality. A donor has a right to come into your office and ask to see the file that you have on them, which is another whole story. In every fundraising profession I've always had, I've got my donor files, of course, but I've always got one in my desk drawer that I call the Pearl Harbor file, because it's full of bombs. Okay. And again, the first job I had here in Tucson, oh my Lord, big fundraising event. I'd just been on staff for about 4 months, and I was, deciding who was going to sit with whom, and I had these 2 board members and the one board member's wife seated at the same table. What I didn't know was that the 2 board members, not the wife, the 2 board members were having a liaison of sorts, okay, that had been going on for some time, and they all knew about it. So over the course of the evening, I got my ears battered by all 3 of them individually out in the hallway because I didn't know about it. So I've always tried to pull out anything like that that is dangerous in a donor's file, that kind of bombshell, and put it in a separate file so that when I transition out of that job and the next person comes in, I can say, you need to read through this, and then leave it for the next person, because they need to know this information too. But every organization has those things. But be careful what you put in donor files, because the Donor Bill of Rights states very clearly that if they come in and want to see what you've got on them, they have a right to see it.
I'm gonna file that up here.
Okay. Third-party events we talked about a little bit, but having a policy in place for who can do third-party events, what's the process? I actually have a form that I like to use that when someone approaches me, if I'm working with an organization and says, I want to do an event to raise money for you guys, I say, that's great, that's wonderful. We have this form we need you to fill out so it can go to our board development committee so they can review it and approve it. And you know, when it gets into the nuts and bolts of it and they have to put down a budget and show how they're projecting to raise money and all that stuff, sometimes they just kind of decide they're not going to do the event when they really start looking at it, because very often these individuals who are well-intentioned, you know, like the dancers in Florida, they're well-intentioned, but they've never really done this before. They've never really put a budget together before. They've never really understood that you have to have a liquor license and that it takes a long time to apply for one and get one, or that the organization is limited to the number of liquor licenses they can get in a year, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, what you don't want to have happen is having a lot of organizations out there raising money for you and not really making a profit, and so you're not really getting any money, but the perception in the community is that lots and lots of fundraisers are going on for your organization. So you got to be very careful about them, and having a policy in place to govern specifically those kinds of fundraising events is really important. How many of you have organizations that do outside fundraising for you? Well, organizations that are not part of your organization, but they do a fundraising event to raise money for you.
Okay, in our organization, they've partnered with like a restaurant or something and they've done a wine tasting. Would that be the same thing? Or, and then I have a question about that. If they held a wine tasting in a private home, were they supposed to get a liquor license?
No, no.
Okay.
But this, I'm talking more about like, you know, a Sigma Chi fraternity at the university wants to do a kegger and raise money for your children's charity. You know, do you have a policy in place that would say yay or nay to that?
So in Kentucky, we had an owner of a business who decided to have everyone who came to get haircuts or whatever that day, he was providing a certain amount towards this financial assistance fund we needed for a family. So is that considered what you're saying? Is that what you're
Yeah, it's third party. Somebody else is doing the fundraising for you. And the biggest question that comes into play for me is who's handling the money and how is the money being handled? You know, is it 20s being thrown into a shoebox someplace, or do they really have financial controls? How do you know that you're actually getting the money that is being donated? Right here and then over here.
Just a quick comment. An easy way to think about it is if your organization is not coordinating the event, then it's a third-party event. Usually happens with, I have a couple clients that are fairly well-known. That's usually the people that will have third-party events.
Yeah.
There's a big organization here in town called Angel Charity, and it was mentioned here before, and they, I guess the thing to do is make sure you do your due diligence.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why I like a form that they fill out that lays out the event, specifies the date, the time, who they're expecting to attend, who they're going to invite. Again, I can put an example on my website if you want to just grab it and fluff it up to meet your organization's needs. But you know, asking those kinds of questions up front, and especially asking the questions about financial management and who's in charge, and do you expect our board members to attend? Do you expect us to advertise it on our website for you? Do you expect to use our office equipment? Do you expect to use our telephones? Do you expect to, all of that stuff? Because those are the things that don't get asked about up front that end up causing the problems. So having the policy in place for how and when you're going to accept third-party events is important. We talked about, and when we were doing the green sheet thing, we talked about list exchanges. How many of you do some kind of list exchange now? Anyone? You do? Yeah, it's fairly typical for organizations to share lists of like-minded organizations because often there's crossover between their databases. For instance, the performing arts organizations in town, you know, the opera, the symphony, the Arizona Theater Company, the big performing arts organizations, they all send out mailers to their subscribers saying, won't you subscribe again next year? And then they send out a list to people who bought single tickets that year and they say, won't you consider subscribing next season? And then they all exchange lists. And so, you know, the symphony will send to U of A Presents list and say, gee, you like U of A Presents, maybe you like subscribing to the symphony. Why don't you consider buying a subscription to the symphony? So they all kind of do that every year. And there's an agreement, a formal written agreement between them that they can do that kind of list exchange. Some boards like that because they see it as a way of building their base. Other boards will have a policy that strictly says we cannot do that. So it varies from organization to organization. I'm not trying to say one way is right or one is not. It depends on the organization. But minimally, you should have a policy in place. Otherwise, staff is left to make that decision on their own. And it doesn't matter how the staff makes the decision, the board will get upset about it. That's been my experience. Okay, so just having a policy in place about that is important. Using outside solicitors and having your board discuss that and whether or not that's acceptable. What I mean by an outside solicitor is not an organization, you know, wanting to do a fundraising event for you, but rather hiring a company that does telefunding and asking people for donations by telephone, or hiring an outside company to do your direct mail for you. Those kinds of solicitation companies exist out there, but again, if you know, it's something the board should discuss. Is this something we want to do? Do we have enough control as a board of what kind of information is going out there if we're hiring an outside company to do it? Just out of curiosity, do any of you have an outside solicitor's policy? A written outside solicitor's policy? Nope. Okay. Meeting marketing or marketing promotion. We mentioned this, touched on this a little bit earlier, but use of the organization's logo is a biggie. It's a biggie. Have any of you had disasters with outside organizations using your logo inappropriately or something?
We've had a near disaster. I used to be with the Skin Cancer Institute at the Arizona Cancer Center doing fundraising, and a spirits company contacted us. And I've learned now that when people contact you and offer you money, to always beware and listen and dig and dig. And it turned out that they wanted to relate Sun Safety to more like summer beverage sales. And they wanted to put the U of A logo over an alcohol display in liquor stores. And so luckily the Cancer Center, of course, has excellent policies and procedures, and it was really easy then to say, we can't do this because we're U of A. It was really nice to blame everything on U of A.
Yeah.
But our board was really upset because they thought, oh guys, this is an opportunity. You know, we're pushing away money. Are we insane? We really need money. And it was nice for us as leadership in the organization to say, remember, look at the policies of the U of A, but it led to a discussion about what our actual policies as a small nonprofit within the university should be.
Another great example of being able to put a piece of paper between you and the problem. That piece of paper can really help you out in a situation like that. Yes?
Should the name, logo, and images, should they be trademarked?
They can be.
Will that help in this case?
Maybe. I'm not a trademark attorney. I don't know. I mean, the problem is, and again, I hate to keep beating up on third-party events because some of them are really wonderful when people are out there really legitimately wanting to do volunteer work to raise money for your organization. But as soon as you hand your logo over to them, and if there's no structure about how it can and cannot be used, you're a little bit helpless. You're a little bit helpless. So be very careful about it. But having a policy in place puts that piece of paper between you and that organization, so it doesn't become a personal conflict. It's like, oh, you know, I wish that you could show that logo over the beer display. I really, really do, because I know how much good promotion could come from that. But our board, you know, has put this policy in place that doesn't allow us to do that. So again, just having that piece of paper between you and the problem can be wonderful for you. Other questions? Okay. Qualified spokesperson. Anybody have an incident where they had someone on staff or someone from the board who wasn't authorized to do so, having a microphone shoved in their face and they say something really stupid? You had that happen? Is it something you can share?
Well, I don't know about a specific example, but we do have a policy now written.
You have a written policy, and how does the policy lay itself out?
Who can speak for the organization? And when you get a request from media, how is that directed?
Yeah. It's really important. It's really important, and again, it's one of those things that becomes important when there's a crisis. And you know, the board president and the executive director might be huddled on the phone for 3 hours trying to figure out the exact wording of the press release that's going to go out about it. And meanwhile, they flip on the news, and one of the other board members is talking to the media and saying all kinds of things wrong. Okay, I mean, it happens so frequently. So having a policy in place that everyone understands is really important. Do you know what cause-related marketing is?
I can guess.
Guess.
Oh, I always hand the microphone to some bull-headed kid. I don't care what they say.
Well, no, but that's another good thing to talk about. But cause-related marketing is actually a term, it's sort of this fundraising / marketing thing where a nonprofit organization partners with a for-profit company in a promotion. And you know, somebody mentioned the example of the haircuts. You know, you go to this barber shop or this hair salon, you get a haircut, and $5 of every haircut goes to help the Boys and Girls Club. That's an example of cause-related marketing, but you see it on a large scale nationally, where you know, an organization that sells, you know, paint thinner or something is going to give $1 of every can of paint thinner to a Save the Environment fund. You know, but they're generally doing it for self-promotion reasons. They're doing it because they want to position their company as being supportive of a certain cause. That's fine, and it can raise a lot of money, especially if you land one of those big national deals, but what's the policy underlying it? You know, do you really, if you're an environmental organization, do you really want your name out there in association with the paint thinner company? I had an example come up. I don't know how to talk about this without talking about the organization. I worked with a local organization that is it's an organization that fits in the conservation and environmental kind of milieu, okay? And they had a wonderful grant writer who'd been very successful in finding new grants for them, okay? She was successful in getting a fairly significant grant from the Monsanto Corporation, which makes Roundup and hybridizes seeds so that farmers who plant them can spray the entire crop with Roundup and the crop won't die but the weeds will. And they're suing small farmers because some of the seeds from their crop were carried by the wind over into the neighbor's field, and lots of bad press about Monsanto, okay? And the board just erupted. And they were just at loggerheads, and they brought me in and said, help us, we gotta work through this. And I said, okay, show me your policy. What policy? Well, show me your policy that governs what kinds of organizations the grant writer can go after. Oh, well, we don't have a policy about that. Well, show me the procedure that tells me what process the grant writer is supposed to go through before she applies to a new corporation. Well, we don't have that either. Well, there's your problem. Okay, so we had to rewind that tape back to the policy decisions underlying the problem. Now, again, this is an example of you can't anticipate every problem that's going to come up. You just can't. But again, if they had some solid policies in place, they would have had a better structure for dealing with the issue when it arose. Okay, but that's cause-related marketing. Be very careful about it. For-profit companies are looking for something to benefit them. And that's not a bad thing. Corporations exist to make a profit for their shareholders.
They're selling their image, that's what they're doing.
They're selling your image to make a profit. You've got to be careful with that. It's not always a bad thing. Sometimes it is. Yes, ma'am.
We have a kind of minor recurring issue with a donor who wants to donate, let's say, in the name of Muhammad, and they want to make sure that the family in need knows that this is coming from their special religious person who might be named Muhammad. Please let them know that. And you're like, wow, do I have to match, try and find someone of that same faith? That's going to be tough. How do we, so someone who wants to donate in the name of someone, get it to someone who may or may not recognize that name as a value?
Going back to the gifts acceptance policy, I mean, we're off the topic of marketing again now, but going back to fund development. In the gifts acceptance policy, if you've had issues with that kind of specificity, then you can build something into the gifts acceptance policy that says, you know, we retain the right to reject any gifts that might have a designation that's not possible for the organization to fulfill, or would be extremely difficult for the organization to fulfill. There's nothing wrong with that, but again, try to put that piece of paper between you and the potential donor so that it's not a personal rejection.
We may not be able to have to say we reject it, but we can say we will not provide specific information.
Yeah. The issue that you're talking about is actually a bigger issue, and it has to do with donor specificity in making gifts. And there's a great example having to do with endowment of a church on the East Coast that back in about 1964 received an endowment gift from a parishioner in her will. She left a gift to the church of $100,000, the earnings of which could only be used to purchase flower arrangements for the sanctuary. Now, if you think about it, it was a very generous gift. An endowment of $100,000 spins off about $5,000 a year on average, 5%, say, $4,000, $5,000 a year. Okay? So you think about it, that's, you know, a $75 to $100 flower arrangement in the church every Sunday. That's wonderful. That's wonderful. The church had the misfortune of having really good investment advice, and they invested that money really well. And in the 1990s, that fund had over $1 million in it, spinning off more than $50,000 a year that could only be used for the purchase of flowers. Okay? So again, the problem here was there was no policy in place saying, you know, these are the kinds of requirements we have for endowment gifts. And yes, they can be a named endowment and they can be for a specific purpose. These are the approved purposes for which they can be applied. Pick one. Okay?
Community foundations do that.
Community foundations do it a lot because they've had this problem. They've had this problem. Okay. I'm not going to get into social media again because that was just hard. All right? I think we've got time to do this real quick. Just work in the same groups you worked in before and just come up with a little bit of language, no, not the social media thing, but let's have some language about, and let's just narrow this down to use of the organization's logo. So come up with one of the organizations that you represent in your group or a fictitious organization and just come up with a couple of lines that could be the basis of a policy document for how the organization's logo can be used. Okay, just take about 5 minutes. I want to hear what you came up with. See what the winner is here. Who has something they feel really good about?
Medium good.
Medium good. We have medium good. Does anybody have moderately to high good? All right, let's go with medium good. What did you come up with?
Our logo will only be used for organization-sponsored events, publications, and social media.
Wow. It's only used for organization-sponsored events. Okay, so if someone's doing a fundraiser for you, they could say that they're doing it for you, but they can't use your logo.
Yeah, I think that's really strict. I would.
Yeah.
Okay, that's up there. Yes?
A little bit different verbiage, we thought, because of the Monsanto problem, include verbiage appropriate to the goals and missions of the organization. You could turn something down, and, don't feel it's appropriate to our,
Okay.
for example, a wildlife association, and here comes Armored Meat Company, and they're going to make a big donation to you. Conflict.
Yeah. So putting something in there about it has to be used in a way that's consistent with the mission. Some organizations actually have their graphic designers who do their logo for them come up with a one sheet of specifications of how the logo can be used to make sure that the pixels are big enough that it's not all, unpixelated or whatever the word is, that when they use it on their banner or something, they'll have very specific requirements in terms of color, specific requirements in terms of color of background, specific requirements in terms of font type that can be used, that kind of thing. So, having a one page like that can be handed out to some organizations can also be part of the, and again, we're talking about the crossover here between policy and procedure, but there are ways to let outside groups use your logo, but you can still retain control over what it looks like. So, Ken.
There's an interesting TV commercial on right now for Liberty Insurance that shows the Statue of Liberty, but the Statue of Liberty is all kind of blurred up. My guess is that there's a problem if they're using the actual picture of the Statue of Liberty.
I don't know. Could be. Could be. That happens locally. A client of mine recently was Patronato, the organization that raises money for the restoration of San Javier Mission. Do you know how many organizations in this city use San Javier Mission's image on their logo? The county uses San Javier Mission on its shield. Don't put that on the tape. Okay. The public library. I mean, you see it all over the place.
So who owns it?
Well, they do, but everyone uses it. It's it's a little bit dicey. It's a little bit dicey.
Well, we have an odd situation. So we've been around for 28 years. And we're very loosely organized around the country. Not quite parent, but the organization that formed in Bethesda, Maryland, that really works more closely with the U.S. government on policy and insurance and things like that, decided that the name Candlelighters Childhood Cancer Foundation had sort of funny religious connotations, maybe whatever. The candles weren't necessarily it. The motto was what? It's better to light one candle than to curse the darkness. They changed their name and logo too and said, this is what we are wanting you all to do, the American Childhood Cancer Organization. And we will hold your copyright or something of Candlelighters for 5 years. After that time, you guys are all on your own.
Yeah.
So, the value of my logo and name is diminishing over the years.
Well, and you bring up another issue, which is national organizations. National organizations guard their logos like you wouldn't believe. Talk to the American Cancer Society sometime. And a number of years ago, I was doing some work in Phoenix with the national organization for Make-A-Wish is in Phoenix. They have 3 attorneys on staff whose job it is to chase down people who are using their name inappropriately and using their logo inappropriately, because they get these scam telefunding companies that call up people and say, "Hi, I'm a volunteer. Have you ever heard of Make-A-Wish Foundation?" They're not from Make-A-Wish Foundation, but they give the impression that they are and ask for a contribution that be sent to such and such a place. So you've got to be very, very vigilant about guarding your name, guarding your logo. Yes?
Correct. Naomi and I sort of negotiated a truce with the American Cancer Society. So it was, Camp Sunrise, Camp Sunshine, and the American Cancer Society was going to take them on legally. But they had the authority. You can't sort of legalize some of these things, but they're having camps for children with cancer in Arizona, and it's like, whoa, this is getting too close and too, we're not comfortable with you moving into our territory, and it gets very territorial and uncomfortable. So there are issues. I'm a bit of a sort of libertarian on some of this stuff,
but you can see
seriously.
You can see some of the issues that come into play when you start trying to put this policy together. This group right here asked me a question. Are we talking about use of the logo internally or use of the logo externally by other groups? Well, you got to have a policy that covers both. You really have to have it all delineated. I'm going to move on just in the interest of time, because you don't want to stay here until 8 o'clock, and neither do I. Program policies. We talked about this earlier, but policy related to client privacy for those who are dealing with populations of people in need, really, really important, just really important. And I assume that most human services organizations have that stuff buttoned down. But again, these are policies are never hard and fast, and they need to be reviewed periodically. Because even when you talk about client privacy, what do you do with issues like clients who want to become your employees' friends on Facebook? That's a new thing. I assume that's happening. 10 years ago, it wasn't an issue. It was really easy to maintain client privacy. But if your clients want to be your friends on Facebook, do they give up some of that privacy? How do you handle that? What's the overriding policy that addresses that? But it has to be discussed. Non-compete policy for, I'm talking about programs specifically. If you've got a board member, if you're providing music lessons to disadvantaged children after school as one of your core programs, and you've got a board member who decides that you're not reaching enough people, so on her own she's going to start a program for disadvantaged students for giving them music lessons after school. How do you handle that? That's a program policy that needs to be in place, that people affiliated with the organization don't start programs that compete with your policies. What kinds of service providers can you use? What are the requirements for the personnel, especially if they're working with disadvantaged children or something? What kinds of policies have to be in place before you make an agreement to work with an outside service provider? And a program evaluation policy, of course, to annually or semi-periodically, but on a regular basis, look at all your programs and discuss and really look critically at how effective they are and whether they're really achieving what they set out to achieve. Organizations that have been around for a long time sometimes have programs in place that have just exceeded their value. I worked a number of years ago with an animal rights organization in Phoenix that, it was great. They rented this huge cabin in Flagstaff and had a 3-day retreat with me and their senior staff. It was great fun. But what we were doing was looking at their programs, because their programs had just become calcified almost, and nobody dared let them go. And every single program had at least 2 defenders on the board. And they had one program that was serving 8 people. 8 people. There were 4 staff members working full-time on that program. It was serving 8 people. You know, so again, bringing somebody in from the outside to do program evaluation periodically, but what I helped them then do was to put in place a policy that required the board to bring somebody in to do program evaluation every 5 years to make sure that didn't happen again. Okay? Information management, we've talked about it peripherally as well, but policies requiring data that mandate how data is to be secured by the organization. There's a big shift going on, you know, in information technology now, where organizations are moving away from in-house servers to putting information on the cloud. I can't tell you how many organizations out there are now moving from server-based donor software to cloud-based donor software, and their board's not even having a discussion about it. Staff's making that decision. And what's happening is the board members are finding out that all this donor data is now in the cloud, and they're going, "What? Hey, what? Nobody ever asked me about that. I have an opinion about that." So if the board is proactive in looking at policies regularly and staying ahead of the curve in terms of information technology, it's really important. A policy for different security levels of information within the system, and also Wi-Fi and remote access. I worked with an organization here in Tucson that had a big facility, big office facility, and had a lot of volunteers who were coming in and out, in and out, and in and out, and in and out, okay? And they were asking for Wi-Fi. And so they gave them a Wi-Fi code, and all of a sudden, you know, within a matter of months, 50 different people had the Wi-Fi code that gave them access to client information, that gave them access to donor information. It was out of control. It was completely out of control. But they thought they were doing their volunteers a nice service because their volunteers wanted to check their email while they were there, you know? Kind of made sense. But there wasn't a policy in place, so it ran amok. We talked a little bit about web content policy. But again, once you have, you know, as soon as you have a website, if you have a lot of different sub-organizations or subgroups or third parties that want to do things for you, everybody wants a piece of the website. So before you establish the website, having a policy in place that says, look, our primary purpose of the website is this, our secondary purposes are this and this. Anything that doesn't meet those purposes doesn't belong on our website. If someone wants to add something new to the website, it has to go through this process. You know, having that kind of policy laid out, again, it puts a piece of paper between you and the problem when someone confronts you with it. Advocacy is another area where most organizations don't have clear-cut policies. And first of all, you all know, I hope, that nonprofits can lobby, right?
Sorry?
Nonprofits can lobby, right?
Yes.
Okay, a lot of people don't know that. They think nonprofits are prevented from lobbying. You can lobby issues, you can't lobby for candidates. That's the basic distinction. So if there's an issue that's important to your organization, it's really important that you have some structure in place for how and how not that issue can be addressed in an advocacy arena. A number of years ago, I was for about 8 years, I was on the consultant roster for the Arizona Commission on the Arts and working with arts organizations all over the state, one of which had gotten into a big muddy hole because they had received a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts, and it happened to be the same year that the photographer Robert Mapplethorpe had gotten a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts for photographs that, or for a display of photographs that many considered to be pornographic. I consider them to be pornographic, and that means they were pretty bad. But the National Endowment for the Arts gave a grant to this organization, and several of the board members just erupted. We shouldn't be taking money from the National Endowment for the Arts. But again, there was no policy in place that governed that kind of relationship. So especially when you're talking about government grant recipient agencies and that kind of thing, having advocacy policies in place, really important. Some grants actually prevent you from doing advocacy. So being aware of that, being sensitive to that, having a policy in place to handle that is good. My biggest concern about this is the very last bullet here, which is, and has to do with the example that I gave. If you have a policy in place, how does that policy get communicated to new board members coming in? Because they almost by default become your advocates in the community. So how are they to represent the organization in the community? What are they expected to do and what are they expected not to do? Last but not least, I want to talk a little bit about miscellaneous kinds of policies. Somebody asked earlier about a policy related to facilities usage. Whoever asked that question, thank you. If you own a facility, knowing how the facility can be used by staff, by board members, by other groups that may want to use it, what do you charge? All of those things should be established by the board. So staff's not left sort of foundering and wondering, well, we charge this group because we like them and we're gonna we don't like them and we're not gonna charge this group because we like them. But having clear-cut policies in place for that are really, really important. And the same thing has to do with the use of equipment and technology. If you have, trying to think of a borrowing equipment example, but if you own stuff that other people want to use, what is your policy for it? If they damage it or lose it or break it or destroy it, what is your policy that they need to know about up front? Use of fax machines, use of office equipment, that kind of thing. This often becomes a problem with those third-party fundraisers who think that because they're doing it for you, your copy machine should be available to them to make 9,000 flyers on a Tuesday when you need the copy machine. Having policies in place for the use of equipment, the use of real estate and space is really very, very important.
Clyde, one of the things you might not think about is handing out keys.
Oh, thank you.
Taking keys back from employees that are leaving.
Security policies.
Keys to someone so they can get into your facility.
And how many, I worked with one church group that, to make things simple, they had all of the keys in the entire facility rekeyed so they all were opened by the same key, and then they gave it out to about 50 people in the congregation, one of whom, guess what, lost his keys.
Yeah.
And it cost them a couple of $1,000s to have all of the locks rekeyed. So you have to be very, very careful about that. And frankly, if they'd had a policy in place that lost keys, the person who lost the key had to pay for the rekeying of all the locks, my guess is the keys never would have been lost in the first place. Okay, but they didn't have that kind of policy in place, and so the church had to eat it. There are a lot of resources out there that can help you. Your library is the first place you start. There's some excellent books on the back of the table. I just went onto the library's website and pulled up these, a couple of which have to do specifically with policies for nonprofits. There's one up here that I did on financial management policies and one on human resources policies for nonprofits. But check them out, read them, photocopy them illegally, I don't care. But there is information out there. You don't have to start with a blank sheet of paper. I guess that's the most important thing. The other thing, somebody also mentioned this earlier, but talk to other nonprofit organizations. The key here is you want to make sure there's similar organizations so you don't end up with a problem like was mentioned over here, where they pulled a human resources manual from a for-profit company and tried to make it apply. You look for similar kinds of organizations and just call them up and ask them, hey, we're in the process of revising our human resources procedures manual, policies manual. Have you updated yours recently, and would you mind sharing it with us because we need some good ideas? Okay? Most nonprofits are very collegial and they'll help you with that kind of thing. So get some good examples and provide them to the board. You know, one of the roles of staff members is to help collect this stuff. Your board members are there as volunteers. They don't have time, most of them. They don't have time to make the calls, and they don't have the relationships with the organizations you collaborate with. But if you place those calls, you can probably get copies of some really good examples that others are using. Or even better, get copies of really bad ones so you can fix them. Okay? And then go to your other board members and ask the board members outright, you know, we need to have a policy in place for investment management. Have any of you served on the boards of other organizations that have good investment policies we might be able to look at? Many board members have served on other boards and have access to this stuff. So don't overlook them as a source. I put some web sources up here that I think are particularly good, and I think they're listed in your handout as well. Board Source is one of the best. They have some great examples of policies. Capacities, I can never say their name, but they have some really wonderful things as well in terms of policy document examples that you can just download and modify to fit your organization. Independent Sector. I put my personal website up here for my company. There is a resources page on that website, and on there I've got this little box that says for students of the library class on January 23rd, and I put all those policy documents that pertain to fundraising up there. And I believe on that same page, it might not be listed in that box, but there is an example of a third-party fundraising application form that I created that you could borrow and modify to meet your needs. There is an example of a gifts acceptance policy that's fairly generic that you could use to start a gift acceptance policy discussion going in your organization. So check it out, please. And you have my website, my email address as well if you want to get in touch with me about anything specific. If I've got examples of them, I'd be happy to share. Okay, it is 6:06 and implementation. Real quick, yes.
I just want to make one comment. Ask similar organizations. Because I work in libraries. Sometimes, they'd have a question, well, should we charge for copies of our programs? Professional librarians are sitting around all day long, reinventing the wheel, arguing. So, like, when I was in charge of it, I just write 5 or 6 other universities, usually in the Ivy League.
Yeah.
And then they'd say, well, we can't charge you this. Well, at Harvard they do this, or at Columbia they do this. And that's almost like you say having a policy. Well, if you do it, if it's okay for Harvard, why not? Why can't we do it? So, there is an advantage. Contact similar organizations.
Similar organizations have been, I don't think I've ever been turned down when I've made a request for a copy of someone's policy. I don't think I ever have. Implementation. First of all, staff, I mentioned some of these things, but staff really knows what day-to-day policies are needed. So making those recommendations to the board is really important. Collecting examples for the board to help them start their discussion is really important. I guarantee you, if you tell the board you need a policy and they start with a blank piece of paper, you're going to end up with crap. Okay, so just give them something to work with. And then, of course, the staff needs to provide the office support for maintaining policies and for updating policies when the board makes changes and that kind of thing, making sure that the policies manual is up to date. Boards need to prioritize. You can't do this all at once. Some of these things can be farmed out to committees that make sense. If you have a marketing committee, have them look at the logo issue. If you have a fundraising committee, have them look at the adoption of the fundraising ethical standards issues. They can make those recommendations then to the full board for adoption. So you can get that kind of committee work going. It's a great activity for board members. Make sure that for you on the boards, make sure that you implement policies after you've had discussion with staff members about them. If we put this policy in place, how hard is it going to be to implement it? Are there suggestions that you can make of how we should tweak this policy that's going before the board for approval that would make it more manageable? But have that discussion with staff so it's not the board imposing these things on staff as much as it is the board creating policy that can actually help the staff in their day-to-day.
How far deep do you go in getting consensus? You said the board, the staff. How about volunteers, or if it's a youth-based organization, do you ask the parents? I mean, how far deep do you go?
And it depends on the kind of policy you're talking about. You're not going to ask, parents about, to review the investment policies the board is considering, for instance,
I'm just concerned
But
about
if you're
analysis paralysis, though. The deeper you go, the wider the abyss becomes, and then the possibility of analysis paralysis.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, but most nonprofit committees, nonprofit board committees, can have other people other than board members on those committees. They don't have to, some organizations will restrict committee participation to board members only. But if your organization allows non-board members to serve on the committees, get the appropriate staff members on those committees, get the parent representation on the committees so that you can say, we had representation from staff involved in this, we had representation from parents involved in this, here's the policy we came up with, we'd like it voted on at the next board meeting. Okay? Yes. Stakeholders, yeah.
I'm not sure if you addressed this, and I apologize for coming in late, but where do you turn if you have a problem? If you've gone to the board, you've gone to the board president, you've gone to the executive director, you've gone to other administration. I don't know of any nonprofit police. Who do you turn to when you really know that there's something wrong that's impacting?
With IRS.
I know.
Yeah.
Eventually they seem to get.
When you say there's something wrong, you mean in terms of a policy that should be in place that is not?
No, if you know that there's something egregious going on, do you know that there's misuse of funds? Donor funds are not being distributed appropriately, or that labor laws are being violated, or if you just know that certain things are going on.
This goes again to the absence of a policy, because there's not a whistleblower policy in place at your organization, obviously. Okay, and that might be what you. Rather than going to the board with the problem saying, we need to have a whistleblower policy in place to make it possible, if anything should ever happen, for a board member, for a staff member to be able to bring the issue forward without reprisal. That's really important. That's really important, especially if something's going on already.
I had that issue. You go to the funder, the funding source, and they have parameters set. If the monies are federal, there are organizations that do the oversight. And say it's the Department of Education. You can go up right on their site, and there are steps that you can take if you feel like there's a problem, and you can report the problem anonymously. You don't have to reveal yourself. Or if it's a state funder, the state has steps that you can take.
Yeah.
But if it's a private funder or corporation, then I don't know about that.
I think that's a good suggestion for those kinds of funding sources. If it is a private source, though, or it might not even be related to a funding source, having a whistleblower policy in place is really at the crux of that problem. There needs to be a way for that issue to surface without it coming back to bite the employee who raises the issue.
When you think an audit, I don't know if this organization, but ours isn't big enough that we can pay for an audit, and an audit might be helpful too.
Thank you all very much. It is 6:14. I'll stick around for a few minutes for questions. Thank you.